This happened last October, on a Saturday night, right before Halloween. Me and my friends decided to hit up this Halloween party at a guy's house that one of us knew from work. I didn't know the host personally, but he was cool with us crashing, and the place was packed when we got there. It was your typical Halloween vibe: pumpkins on the porch, fake cobwebs everywhere, loud music, people in all kinds of costumes. I wasn't really feeling it at first. I had on a lazy vampire costume, just some fake teeth and a cape, nothing crazy. My friends went all out though. Tom dressed as Michael Myers, and Sarah went as a zombie bride. There were so many people in masks, I couldn't even tell who was who after a while. Anyway, we're there for about an hour, just drinking and talking in the kitchen, when this guy walks in. He's wearing a hospital gown and has these plastic handcuffs hanging off his wrists. His hair's all messy, and he's got dark circles under his eyes like he hasn't slept in days. At first, I thought it was a decent costume, kind of creepy but nothing special. The guy was acting weird though, like he wasn't talking to anyone, just standing in the corner, watching people. And not like in a shy guy at a party way, more like he was studying people. I tried not to think much of it, but Sarah leaned over to me and whispered that the guy was giving her the creeps. I was starting to feel it too. Then he starts walking through the party, bumping into people like he doesn't care. At one point, he grabbed this girl's arm, really hard, and she yanked it away. She gave him this look like, "What the hell?" but then just laughed it off, probably thinking it was all part of his act. But it felt off. A couple of hours pass, and this dude is still hanging around, but now he's getting in people's faces, making weird comments. One guy asked him what he was supposed to be, and the guy just stared at him for a solid 10 seconds before saying,
"You wouldn't believe me if I told you."
Then things started getting really messed up. At some point, the host's dog, a big German shepherd, starts barking like crazy from the backyard. We all thought maybe someone was messing with it or something, but the barking wouldn't stop. A couple of people went outside to check, but when they came back in, they looked kind of freaked out. They said they saw someone running through the yard, but it was too dark to see who it was. Then, not even 5 minutes later, all the power in the house cuts out. Music stops, lights go out, and suddenly we're all standing in pitch black darkness. I could hear people freaking out, stumbling around to find their phones or a flashlight. Someone said it was probably just a blown fuse, but I had this bad feeling in my gut, like something wasn't right. People were using their phones as flashlights, and that's when I saw him again, the hospital gown guy, just standing there, in the middle of the living room, dead still. No phone in his hand, no nothing. He wasn't even moving. He was just staring straight ahead, eyes wide open, not blinking. Someone yelled, "Hey man, that's enough. The joke's over." But he didn't move. Not an inch. The host, he was this big guy, not someone you'd mess with, finally steps up and walks over to him, telling him to leave if he's going to keep acting like a creep. But the guy doesn't say a word. He just turns his head, slowly, to look at the host. Then he starts laughing. Not a normal laugh, though. It was this deep, guttural sound, like he was forcing it out, but nothing about it felt funny. Next thing we know, the guy pulls out a freaking knife, a real one. It wasn't one of those plastic props people had. This thing was shining in the light of everyone's phones, and that's when the panic started. People were screaming, pushing each other to get out of the way. The host tried to grab him, but the guy was quick. He slashed at him, and the host stumbled back, holding his arm. That's when all hell broke loose. Everyone rushed for the doors, but it was a madhouse. People were pushing and shoving, trying to get out as fast as they could. I remember grabbing Sarah's hand and dragging her towards the kitchen, where there was a side door. We could still hear the dog barking like crazy outside, and in all the chaos, the guy was just walking after us like he had all the time in the world. He wasn't even running, just following. We managed to get out of the house and ran to the front yard, but we weren't safe yet. People were still screaming inside, and when I looked back, the guy was just standing at the door, watching everyone leave. He didn't follow us outside, but that creepy grin on his face was burned into my brain. It felt like hours before the cops finally showed up, but it was probably only a few minutes. When they got inside, the guy was gone. Vanished. They searched the house and the backyard, but there was no sign of him. Later, we found out that the guy wasn't just some partygoer with a weird sense of humor. He was an actual patient who had escaped from a mental health facility about 30 miles away earlier that day. They said he was dangerous, but no one had seen him since. I don't know what his plan was or why he came to that party, but I can't stop thinking about how close we all were to something a lot worse happening. I won't be going to any Halloween parties this year. I live in a pretty quiet neighborhood surrounded by woods. It's peaceful most of the time, but nights like this make me uneasy. It was one of those stormy fall nights with the rain pounding hard enough to make it sound like someone's outside. I was home alone. My parents were out of town, and I figured it would just be a chill night of binge-watching TV and ignoring the weather. Around 10 p.m., just as I was settling in, the power went out. The whole house went dark, and for a second, I thought maybe the storm had knocked something out. It wasn't unusual for the power to flicker during bad weather, but it never went out like this. My heart started racing a little. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. I figured I'd just wait it out, but the silence in the house, broken only by the sound of the storm, made everything feel off. A few minutes passed, and I heard it. A knock on the front door. Not a loud banging, but a steady, deliberate knock. My first thought was that it was a neighbor coming to check on me or something, but why would anyone be out in this storm? I checked the time, 10:15 p.m., way too late for a friendly visit. I hesitated, but decided to go see who it was. My phone light guided me through the dark house as I made my way to the door. I stood there for a moment, listening. The wind and rain were so loud it was hard to focus, but then, there it was again, 3 slow knocks. My stomach dropped. I leaned up to the peephole, and what I saw chilled me to the core. A man was standing there, drenched from the rain, his face partially obscured by the hood of his jacket. He wasn't moving, just standing completely still, facing the door. I didn't recognize him, and something about the way he stood there so still made me feel sick. I backed away from the door slowly, not wanting to make a sound. As I stepped back, the knocking stopped. My heart was pounding now, and I quickly debated what to do. Maybe he would go away. Maybe he thought no one was home. But then I heard the doorknob jiggle. I froze. Whoever this guy was, he was trying to get in. I knew I couldn't just stand there. So I moved as quietly as I could down the hall and into the bathroom. It was the only room in the house with a lock that felt somewhat secure. Once inside, I locked the door and sat on the floor, trying to control my breathing. I kept my phone in my hand, and my thumb hovered over the call 911 button, but something stopped me. It was like my brain couldn't process that this was really happening. Maybe he'd give up and leave. For a few minutes, all I heard was the storm outside. It was almost enough to convince me that he was gone, but then I heard it, a creak from the floorboards in the hallway. He was inside the house. I stifled a gasp, clamping my hand over my mouth. My mind was racing, trying to think of a way out. The bathroom window was too small to crawl through, and I had no way of knowing where he was in the house. I couldn't hear his footsteps, just the occasional soft creak of the floor. It was like he was purposely trying to be quiet, stalking through the house. I don't know how long I sat there, waiting. It felt like hours. Then, out of nowhere, a loud bang rattled the bathroom door. I jumped, barely managing to keep from screaming. He knew I was in here. He had to. The door rattled again, this time harder, followed by a deep, low voice. "I know you're in there," the man said. My blood ran cold. He pounded on the door harder, and I knew it wouldn't hold for long. In a panic, I grabbed the shower rod and yanked it down, holding it like a weapon. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. The door pounded again, and this time it started to splinter. I had to do something. I had to get out. I threw open the bathroom window, the cold, wet wind slapping me in the face. I knew there was no way I'd fit through it, but I stuck my arm out and waved it, hoping someone, anyone, might see me. My only other option was to make a run for it. The moment the door broke, I would have to fight or escape. The door burst open, and in the dim light of my phone, I saw him, tall, soaked, and smiling in the most twisted way I've ever seen. I didn't wait. I swung the shower rod at him as hard as I could, hitting him in the side of the head. He grunted, stumbling back just long enough for me to push past him and sprint down the hallway. I didn't stop. I bolted for the front door, yanking it open and running barefoot into the storm. The cold rain felt like needles against my skin, but I didn't care. I ran to my neighbor's house, screaming for help. By some miracle, they were home. They opened the door, and I collapsed inside, shaking and sobbing. I tried to tell them what happened, but I could barely get the words out. They called the police, who arrived within minutes, but by the time they got to my house, the man was gone. The cops never found him. There was no sign of forced entry, nothing to suggest anyone had been inside. But I know what happened. I still can't explain it, but I know that man was real, and if I hadn't gotten out when I did, I might not be here to tell this story. This happened last week, when my girlfriend Emily and I decided to visit a pumpkin patch just outside of town. We loved the fall season, and picking out the perfect pumpkin was one of our favorite traditions. The sun was setting, casting a warm orange glow over the fields as we arrived. The place was bustling with families and couples, all eager to find their own piece of autumn. We wandered through the rows of pumpkins, laughing and joking about which ones were too lopsided or too small. It was a perfect evening, or so we thought. As we made our way to the far end of the patch, I noticed a man standing alone near the edge of the field. He was tall and wore a long, dark coat that seemed out of place among the cheerful crowd. His eyes followed us as we moved through the pumpkins, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I brushed it off at first, thinking maybe he was just another customer, but as we continued to explore, I could tell that he was watching us. Emily noticed it too and whispered to me, "Do you see that guy? He's been staring at us for a while now." We decided to ignore him and continued picking out our pumpkins, but every time I glanced in his direction, he was still there, watching us with an unsettling intensity. As the sky darkened and the patch began to empty out, we decided it was time to head home. We paid for our pumpkins and made our way to the car. As we were loading them into the trunk, I saw him again, standing by his car in the parking lot, still watching us. Feeling uneasy, we quickly got into our car and drove off. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting him to follow us. At first, there was no sign of him, and I began to relax. But then, just as we turned onto the main road, headlights appeared behind us. I tried to convince myself it was just another car heading home from the patch. But when we made a series of right turns to test if he was following us, he mirrored every move. My heart started pounding. Emily looked at me with wide eyes. "What should we do?" she asked. I didn't have an answer. My mind raced as I tried to think of a plan. Suddenly, the car behind us started flashing its lights repeatedly. It was him. There was no doubt about it now. "Don't stop," Emily urged. "Just keep driving." I nodded and pressed down on the gas pedal, trying to put some distance between us and our pursuer. We took random turns through unfamiliar neighborhoods, hoping to lose him in the maze of streets. After what felt like an eternity of driving in circles, his headlights finally disappeared from view. We both let out a sigh of relief as we made our way back home. Once inside our apartment, we double-checked that all the doors were locked and tried to calm down. We sat on the couch in silence for a while, trying to process what had just happened. About 30 minutes later, just as we were starting to relax again, there was a loud knock at the door. We both froze, exchanging nervous glances. "Who could that be?" Emily whispered. I got up slowly and approached the door cautiously. Peering through the peephole, my heart skipped a beat. It was him, The man from the pumpkin patch stood on our doorstep, looking more menacing than ever. I backed away from the door and whispered urgently to Emily, "It's him." Her eyes widened in fear as she grabbed her phone and dialed 911. Meanwhile, I grabbed a kitchen knife for protection and moved back toward the door. The knocking continued, louder this time, and then stopped suddenly. We held our breath as we listened for any signs of movement outside. Minutes felt like hours as we waited for help to arrive. Finally, we heard sirens approaching in the distance. The police arrived quickly and searched the area, but found no trace of him. We filed a report and gave them all the details we could remember about his appearance and behavior at the pumpkin patch. They promised to keep an eye out for him, but warned us that he might not be easy to find without more information. That night was one of the longest nights of my life. Every creak or rustle outside made me jumpy and paranoid. It took weeks before I could sleep soundly again without imagining those piercing eyes watching me from the shadows. We never went back to that pumpkin patch or any other for fear of encountering him again. To this day, I still wonder who he was and what he wanted with us, or what he planned on doing to us. It was Halloween night, and things had finally calmed down. The trick-or-treaters were gone, and the streets outside my house were empty. I was about to turn off the porch light when there was a knock on my door. It was a little weird considering it was so late, but I figured maybe some teenager was trying to squeeze in one last house. I peeked through the window and there was a girl standing on my porch. She looked to be around 17 or 18, way too old to be trick-or-treating, but she wasn't wearing a costume. What really threw me off was her expression. She looked terrified. I hesitated but opened the door slightly, just enough to see what she wanted. I asked her if I could help her with something. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she just kept looking around nervously, like someone was chasing her. Finally, she blurted out, "I left my candy in your kitchen." I froze. My kitchen? I didn't recognize this girl at all, and I definitely didn't invite anyone inside my house. But the way she said it, it was like she believed it. I told her I thought she had the wrong house, and started to close the door. "No," she insisted. "I left my candy in your kitchen. I need to get it." Her voice was shaky, and her eyes were wide. Something about the way she said it gave me the creeps. I told her again she had the wrong house, and that she needed to leave. But she didn't move. She just kept repeating the same thing over and over. "I left my candy in your kitchen." At that point, I was done. I closed the door and locked it, hoping she'd get the hint and leave. But the second I turned around, there was another knock, this time at the back door. I nearly jumped out of my skin. I walked to the back door slowly and peeked through the glass. It was her again, the same girl. She was standing at my back door, staring straight at me through the glass, still repeating the same eerie phrase. "I left my candy in your kitchen." Now I was really freaked out. I backed away from the door, trying to figure out what to do. She wasn't banging or trying to break in, but she just kept staring at me, repeating the same sentence in that creepy, emotionless tone. I grabbed my phone and called the police, explaining that there was a strange girl at my house who wouldn't leave. They said they'd send someone out, but by the time I hung up, I realized she had stopped talking. I rushed back to the door, but she was gone. I quickly checked the front door and the windows, but there was no sign of her. It was like she had just disappeared. The police showed up a few minutes later, but they didn't find anything either. I told them what happened, and they searched the area, but no one matched her description. The whole thing left me rattled. I kept wondering who she was and where she went. Was she going to come back? I checked my locks twice before going to bed that night, but I barely slept. Her voice still echoes in my mind sometimes. "I left my candy in your kitchen." It was Halloween night, back in 2020. The weather was crappy, windy, cold, with a constant drizzle that made the air feel heavy. Most people had stayed inside that night, and as it got later, the streets emptied. By the time all the trick-or-treaters had gone home, it was just me and my wife left. We decided to go for a walk, like we usually did, to clear our heads before bed. We took our normal route, a quiet path that winds through the neighborhood. There were no cars, no kids, just the sound of our feet on the wet pavement. About halfway through the walk, I noticed a guy walking towards us. Not that weird. We pass people all the time. But as we got closer, something felt off. He wasn't giving us any space. I expected him to step aside, or at least give us some room, but he didn't. He kept walking straight towards me. I had to swerve at the last second to avoid a shoulder bump. He didn't even acknowledge us, just brushed by like we weren't there. I glanced at my wife, who was gripping my arm a little tighter than usual. We kept walking, trying to shake it off. Weird people are everywhere, right? But when I looked back, I saw him standing there, staring at us. His face was shadowed under a hood, but I could feel his eyes on us. And then he started walking in our direction. I stopped, turned around fully, and asked if I could help him with something. He didn't stop. He just muttered under his breath,
I'll kill you both right now.
My heart jumped. For a second, I thought maybe I'd misheard. But then he said it again, louder.
I'll kill you both right now.
I froze. My wife was tugging on my arm, whispering to just keep walking, to ignore him. But I couldn't. I didn't want to show him I was scared, even though I was. I yelled at him and said I was calling the cops. He laughed. It was this low, guttural sound that made my skin crawl.
They'll never make it in time to stop me,
he said. He was getting closer now, his steps slow and deliberate, like he was enjoying watching us squirm. I fumbled for my phone, dialing 911 as fast as I could. My wife pulled me harder, her voice shaking as she begged me to just keep moving. The operator answered, and I quickly explained that some guy was following us, threatening us. They said officers were on the way, but I could hear the doubt in their voice. This guy, he seemed like he knew he had the upper hand. He was only a few feet away when I saw the flashing lights of a police car turn the corner. Relief washed over me. The guy, though, didn't run. Instead, he smiled, a sick, twisted smile, and bolted towards the fence that lined the street. In one fluid motion, he jumped over it like it was nothing. The cops pulled up and I ran over to them, explaining what had happened. They searched the area, but there was no sign of him. He had vanished, like a ghost. The police told us they'd patrol the neighborhood, but I could tell by their faces they didn't expect to find him. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every little noise outside made my heart race. Even now, years later, I can't forget his voice, that laugh, the way he looked at us like we were nothing. We never walked that path again after dark. I never expected to find a house like this for the price I paid. 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, and a couple of acres out in the quiet countryside. It was peaceful, just what I was looking for. And it felt like a steal, almost too good to be true. Maybe that's the first sign I should have paid more attention to. But I was just excited to finally have a place of my own. The first few weeks were fine, but then little things started happening. At first, it was just the lights. I'd turn them off before bed, then wake up to find them on. I chalked it up to faulty wiring or my own forgetfulness. Then, cabinets started opening on their own. I'd close them every morning before work, but they'd be wide open by the time I came home. It was weird, but I figured the house was old. Maybe things were just a little loose. A month in, it got physical. The first time, I was brushing my teeth, and I felt a sharp tug on my hair. It was like someone had grabbed a handful and yanked it back. I whipped around, expecting to see someone there, but I was alone. I laughed it off, telling myself I was just tired or stressed from all the moving chaos. But that night, as I lay in bed, I felt a tap on my shoulder. 3 quick taps, like a knock. I froze, barely breathing, but no one was there. I tried ignoring it. hoping it was my imagination or something that would just pass. But things only got worse. Small items would go missing, only to turn up later in the strangest places. My keys ended up in the freezer once. I'd find the TV remote in my bathroom sink. And then there were the sounds, footsteps in the hallway, whispers I could barely make out, but they were there, just faint enough to feel like they were right in my ear but still far away. I was losing sleep, and my nerves were shot. The worst part was that I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. I tried to tell friends and family, but they looked at me with polite smiles, like I was exaggerating or being paranoid. Maybe I was. So, I tried to handle it on my own. One night, I decided to do some research on the house. I'd never thought to look into its history before. I mean, it's not something you typically do when you're moving into your dream home. But as I searched, I found an article buried deep in local news archives. My house had been the site of a murder-suicide, decades ago. The husband had lost his job, spiraled into depression, and one night, he'd snapped. He killed his wife, then himself. They were found days later by a neighbor who'd heard screams. Apparently, no one had lived here since then. The real estate agent hadn't mentioned a thing. I guess I understood the low price now. That night, everything got worse. It was as if learning the truth had broken some barrier. I was barely asleep when I felt something cold wrap around my ankle and yank me out of bed. I hit the floor hard, my head smacking against the wood. Dazed and terrified, I scrambled to my feet, but as soon as I stood up, something struck me in the shoulder, hard. I was thrown back against the wall, gasping for breath. My heart was pounding, my mind racing. I could barely process what was happening, but I knew one thing. I wasn't alone. Days turned into weeks, and the incidents became relentless. Every night I'd feel a presence, something heavy and angry. I'd hear footsteps in the hall and objects would fly off shelves, aimed right at me. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, and couldn't think straight. My life was unraveling. I tried to stay calm, to remind myself it wasn't real. But it was. I could feel it. Every touch, every shove, every bruise that showed up the next morning. My body was covered in them, marks that seemed to appear out of nowhere. I started to lose track of time, to forget what day it was or when I'd last spoken to someone. My friends stopped calling, and my job was slipping through my fingers. I was a shell of who I'd been just a few months earlier. Then, one night, I reached my breaking point. I was lying in bed, on edge, waiting for whatever might happen. Suddenly, I heard a voice, a whisper, inches from my ear. It said my name, clear as day. Then, laughter. Low, mocking laughter that grew louder, filling the room. I screamed, but the sound died in my throat. It felt like hands were wrapping around my neck, squeezing tighter and tighter until I could barely breathe. I was thrashing, clawing at nothing, trying to free myself. When it stopped, I lay there, gasping for air, my body covered in cold sweat. I realized then that I couldn't stay. Whatever was here didn't want me, and it wouldn't let me leave in one piece if I stayed. I packed up whatever I could fit in my car and left that night. I didn't even care about selling the place. I'd rather lose every cent than spend another second in that house. It's been 6 months since I left. I still have nightmares, still feel phantom touches and hear that laughter in the quiet of the night. I don't think I'll ever really escape that place. Part of me will always be haunted, stuck in that house, replaying those nights over and over. And I have a feeling whatever's in there isn't done with me yet. It was Halloween night, and like most kids our age, me and my friends were out trick-or-treating. We were all between 13 and 15 years old enough to go out alone, but still young enough to care about free candy. There were 4 of us, me, Kevin, Alex, and Jason. We had already hit most of the houses in the neighborhood, but we were determined to fill our bags to the top. As the night went on, the streets started to empty. The little kids had long gone home, and only a few groups of older kids were still out, causing trouble or hitting the last few houses. We came across a house at the end of a dark cul-de-sac. It was one of those older houses that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The windows were dark, and there was no Halloween decoration outside, but the porch light was on, which was always a sign that someone had candy. Jason was the one who suggested we go up. None of us were particularly eager to knock on such a creepy-looking house, but we were competitive, and the thought of extra candy pushed us forward. We walked up to the porch, and Kevin knocked on the door. It was quiet for a moment, and we were about to turn around when the door creaked open. Standing in the doorway was a man, probably in his late 40s or early 50s. He was tall and thin, wearing a plaid shirt and jeans that looked too big for him. His face was pale, and there was something off about his smile. It didn't reach his eyes. "Trick or treat," we said in unison, trying to keep things normal. He stared at us for a second before his smile widened.
"Oh, you kids are just in time. I have some special candy inside if you want. Why don't you come in?"
The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. We all exchanged glances, unsure of what to do. This wasn't normal. Usually people just handed out candy and closed the door. But before we could say anything, the man stepped aside, motioning us in. Alex, who always tried to act tough, shrugged and stepped forward. "Come on, guys. He probably just has good candy." Reluctantly, we followed Alex into the house. The inside was just as creepy as the outside, dimly lit with a weird smell in the air, like something rotting. There was no sign of any candy bowls or Halloween decorations. The man closed the door behind us, locking it with an audible click.
"Wait here. I'll go get the candy,"
he said, disappearing into another room. We stood there awkwardly in the dim living room, none of us saying a word. I noticed Jason was looking around nervously, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Something wasn't right. We should have left the second we walked in, but now the door was locked, and we didn't know how to get out without causing a scene. After what felt like forever, the man came back, but he wasn't holding candy. Instead, he had a small, rusted knife in his hand, grinning like a maniac.
"I have something fun planned for you kids,"
he said in a low, almost whispery voice. Panic set in immediately. Kevin stepped back, bumping into a table, knocking over a lamp that shattered on the floor. "We need to go," I whispered to the others, but the man moved closer, waving the knife in front of him.
"You're not leaving yet. I haven't shown you the best part of the night."
He lunged at us, and that's when everything turned to chaos. Alex grabbed a chair and threw it at the man, hitting him square in the chest. The man stumbled backward, dropping the knife. That was our chance. We bolted for the door, but when we tried to unlock it, we couldn't get it open. The lock was one of those old-fashioned ones that you had to twist just right, and in our panic, none of us could figure it out. The man recovered quickly, picking up the knife again, his eyes wild and crazed. He came at us again, and this time Jason shoved a bookshelf over, blocking his path. We were trapped, and it felt like every second was dragging on forever. Finally, Kevin managed to unlock the door, and we all scrambled out into the night. We ran as fast as we could, not looking back. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like jelly, but I didn't stop until we were far away from that house. We didn't talk much on the way back home. The adrenaline was still pumping through my veins, and I couldn't stop shaking. When we got back to my house, we told our parents everything. At first, they didn't believe us. They thought we were just making up a wild Halloween story. But when they saw how terrified we were, they called the cops. The police went to the house later that night, but when they got there, the man was gone. The house was completely empty, like no one had lived there in years. They found the broken lamp and the bookshelf we knocked over, but other than that, there was no sign of the man. To this day, I have no idea what his plan was, or how long he had been watching us. But every Halloween, when I see kids trick-or-treating alone, I can't help but wonder if they'll end up at the wrong house like we did. happened when I was in my 20s. I'm 36 now. I was sitting at this bar, just waiting for my friend to show up. It was supposed to be a casual night, just catching up over a drink. I got there a bit early, ordered a beer, and started scrolling through my phone. The place wasn't too busy, just the usual crowd. I noticed a guy at the end of the bar who seemed to be looking in my direction, but I didn't think much of it. People look at each other in bars, right? No big deal. Time passed, and my friend texted me that something came up and they couldn't make it. I finished my beer, feeling a bit annoyed but not wanting to waste the night. So, I decided to walk home. It wasn't that late, maybe around 10 p.m., and the walk wasn't far. Plus, the night air felt good after being inside. As I was walking, it felt weird, like someone was behind me. You know that uneasy feeling like you're being watched? I glanced over my shoulder a couple of times, but no one was there. The streets were mostly empty, just the occasional car driving by. But that feeling didn't go away. I tried to brush it off as me just being paranoid. I turned down my street, and that's when I heard footsteps behind me. They weren't fast, just steady, like someone was keeping their distance. I started walking faster, but the footsteps matched my pace. My heart was pounding now. I reached my house, fumbling with my keys, trying to stay calm. I didn't want to make it obvious that I was freaked out. Finally, I got the door open, rushed inside, and locked it behind me. I stood there for a moment, trying to catch my breath, telling myself I was just overreacting. But then I heard it, the sound of someone trying the doorknob. I froze. There was no mistaking it. Someone was out there, trying to get in. I grabbed my phone, ready to call the cops, but before I could, I heard a loud crash. The window by the door shattered. A man climbed through the broken window, and I recognized him immediately. It was the guy from the bar. I backed away, but he was on me in seconds. He had a knife. I don't know how he found me, or why he was doing this, but I didn't have time to think. He forced me upstairs into my bedroom. I was terrified, begging him to take whatever he wanted and leave, but he wasn't interested in robbing me. He wanted to hurt me. He tied me up, gagged me, and started torturing me. I can't even describe the pain. It was like he enjoyed it, taking his time, making sure I was in as much agony as possible. I thought I was going to die. The whole time, I kept praying that my roommate, who was asleep in the other room, wouldn't wake up. I didn't want him to get hurt too. But then, out of nowhere, I heard a noise from the hallway. My roommate had woken up. He must have heard me scream, even through the gag. The intruder froze, clearly startled. I could see the panic in his eyes. He wasn't expecting anyone else to be here. My roommate burst into the room, and the guy bolted. He punched my roommate in the face, ran down the stairs, and jumped out the same window he came in through, running off into the night. My roommate untied me and called the cops, but by the time they got there, the guy was long gone. They never caught him. I don't know what would have happened if my roommate hadn't woken up when he did. I still can't sleep at night, knowing that guy is out there somewhere, knowing what he did to me. It's something I'll never forget. This happened last October. My friend and I were hanging out on a Friday night. She had some weed, so we were just having a fun night, laughing at the stupidest shit. All of a sudden, she got super serious. "How many floors does your building have?" she asked. "I don't know, 15, I think. Why?" I responded. "Perfect," she whispered. She starts telling me about this old urban legend called the elevator game. It's where you take the elevator to certain floors in a certain order, follow some basic rules, and then you get warp zoned into some third world dimension, and everyone who follows the steps ends up missing. Crazy, right? "That is such bullshit, no way that happens," I said. We both started laughing, but she grabbed my arm and said, "Let's go try it." I didn't believe in this shit, but I'm not gonna lie, I was terrified to go try it, especially now after smoking that weed. We made our way down to the lobby. It was late, very dark, and seemed kind of deserted down there. which was odd because my building was usually filled with people going in and out, even in the late hours of the night. "Here goes," I said. We got on the elevator and started the process. We got through the first steps and made it to the fourth step, which was going up to the 10th floor, where you're supposed to hear some whispering but not acknowledge it. The door opened. Standing there was some creep. He got on the elevator with us. Didn't say a word, he just stared at us with a blank expression. He pressed the button to go to the 5th floor, which was actually the next step in the game, so we both got super freaked out. Had to be a coincidence, we thought. We get to floor 5 and the door opens. He extends his arm to block the door from closing.
"Time for you to get off,"
he said. We looked at each other and nodded. We got out. He stood there for what seemed like an hour holding that door open before he smiled and stepped back inside and watched the door close on us. Okay, that's enough. I'm done," my friend said. "That shit was way too creepy." I agreed. We went to the other end of the floor to use the other elevator, but it was out of service. So, the stairs it was. We only had to go up a few floors, but as we're in the stairwell, the lights go out, and we hear a door below us slam shut. Now there's footsteps coming up the stairs, and they're coming fast. I fumbled to find my phone, but I managed to flip on the flashlight. All we could see was a figure coming up the stairs. We tried the next floor exit. It was locked. Went up another floor, locked again. Every exit from the stairs was locked. We were trapped and scared shitless. Whoever was in there was getting closer and closer, and we had nowhere to run or hide. The figure stopped about a half a floor under us.
"You're both going to die,"
they said, then started laughing, which echoed through the stairwell. We knew we had no choice but to try and run past whoever was down there. We took a deep breath and bolted it down the stairs. My friend ran into the figure, knocking them over. I don't think they were expecting that. We were basically jumping from landing to try and get to the bottom as fast as we could. We got to the first floor, door still locked. Then we heard a big bang. Sounded like a gunshot. The lights came back on, and the door unlocked. We ran into the lobby and told the guard to call the police. When the police arrived, they took our story and went to investigate the stairwell. Moments later, they came out and told us there was a deceased man up there. It appeared he had taken his own life. We were in complete shock. No way this just happened. A few days went by and we found out that the man they found up there, he was a missing person from the area. He had been missing for 2 years. Last seen exiting the 5th floor on that same elevator that he got on with us. I've since relocated to a single-story apartment building. I'll never use an elevator or stairwell again, and I'll never ever agree to play any type of urban legend game again. I never thought something like this could happen to me. It sounds like the kind of thing you hear about on the news, but you never think it's going to happen to you or someone you know. This happened about a year ago. My friend Mark and I were just hanging out at my apartment. We were both single at the time, and since we lived in the same building, it was easy for us to chill together, watch movies, play video games, you know, the usual stuff. I lived on the 8th floor, and he was on the 11th. The building was one of those older high-rise ones, not super fancy or anything, but it had a decent view and was pretty quiet most of the time. We were just chilling, watching some classic horror movies. It was getting late, and Mark decided he should head back to his place. He didn't want to crash at my place that night for some reason, though I told him he could. Anyway, after the movie ended, he got up, grabbed his jacket, and headed out the door. I was about to lock the door behind him when I heard him yell. It wasn't a normal yell. It was more like a scream. One of those blood-curdling screams that you don't forget. My heart jumped into my throat. I ran out into the hallway, and that's when I saw this guy, who I'd never seen before, was on top of Mark, holding him down on the ground. He was beating the shit out of him, and Mark was struggling, but the guy was strong, way stronger than he looked. I didn't even have time to think. I just grabbed the bat by my door and ran out and started blasting the guy with it. The dude wasn't big, maybe mid-40s, average build, but he was vicious. When I knocked him off, he turned his attention to me, and that's when I noticed he had a knife. I freaked out and started backing up, but then Mark, who somehow managed to get up, grabbed the guy from behind. We struggled with him, and by some miracle, we managed to wrestle the knife away and hold him down. I was shaking so bad, I thought I was going to pass out. We were both yelling for help, and luckily one of my neighbors must have heard the commotion because they came out and called the cops. It felt like forever, but eventually they showed up and arrested the guy. Turns out he was a neighbor who lived on the 6th floor. After the cops took him away, Mark and I were in total shock. We just sat there in my apartment, not saying much, trying to process what had just happened. When the cops came back to take our statements, that's when they told us the creepy part. Apparently, this guy had been watching us for weeks, maybe even months. They found all this weird stuff in his apartment, photos of Mark and me, notes about our daily routines, even some of Mark's stuff that had gone missing from his apartment. It was like something out of a horror movie. The guy had planned the whole thing, waiting for the perfect moment to attack. The cops said it was pure luck that we managed to fight him off. After that night, Mark and I couldn't stay in the building anymore. It was too much. I moved out a couple of weeks later, and Mark did the same. We still hang out, but things aren't the same. There's always that fear in the back of my mind. Like, what if something like that happens again? I still can't believe how close we came to something much worse. If I hadn't gone after Mark, or if we hadn't been able to fight that guy off, who knows what could have happened. It's the kind of thing that makes you realize how quickly your life can change. Just like that. We both got lucky that night. But I'll never forget the look in that guy's eyes. I never want to feel that scared again.